The year is 878 AD. England is dying. Viking warlords have carved the kingdom into pieces, their longships blackening every shore. Kings have fallen. Cities burn. The last Saxon ruler hides in a swamp, hunted like an animal, his army shattered, his people enslaved. But in the shadows of defeat, a secret is being forged. Not a sword. Not a shield. Something far more dangerous. A weapon so powerful it will break the Viking tide forever and birth a nation from the ashes of conquest. This is the story of how England was saved not by steel, but by an idea that changed warfare itself. What you're about to discover has been hidden in plain sight for over 1,000 years. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you love cinematic history that brings the past to life, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which historical battle you want covered next. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's begin. The winter of 878 arrives not with snow, but with screams. Across the rolling hills of Wessex, the last free Saxon kingdom in England, smoke rises from 100 burning villages. The great heathen army, as the chronicles will name them, moves like a plague across the land. These are not raiders anymore. These are conquerors. Viking jarls who have tasted English blood and silver for decades now claim the earth itself. In the frozen marshlands of Somerset, a man crouches in the reeds, his royal robes traded for rags, his crown abandoned in some forgotten hall. His name is Alfred. King Alfred. Though tonight, kingship seems a bitter joke. Around him huddle fewer than 100 men, the remnants of an army that once numbered thousands. They are cold. They are starving. They are defeated. But Alfred's eyes burn with something the Vikings have not yet extinguished. Not hope exactly. Something harder. Something forged in the furnace of absolute loss. The story of how England reached this desperate hour begins not months but years before, in the blood-soaked saga of the Viking Age. For nearly a century, Scandinavian warriors have descended upon the British Isles in waves of organized violence. What began as hit-and-run raids has evolved into systematic conquest. One by one, the great Saxon kingdoms have fallen. Northumbria, conquered. East Anglia, butchered. Mercia, carved in half. Only Wessex remains, and now even Wessex teeters on the edge of oblivion. The Vikings possess advantages that seem insurmountable. Their mobility is unmatched, their longships capable of striking anywhere along England's endless coastline or penetrating deep inland via its rivers. Their warriors are professionals, men who have known nothing but war since childhood, hardened by raids from Ireland to Francia. Their tactics are sophisticated, combining lightning raids with siege warfare and political manipulation, turning English nobles against each other, exploiting every weakness in the fractured Saxon kingdoms. Against this, Alfred commands a feudal levy system designed for a different kind of war. His FYRDS, the militia forces raised from each shire, are farmers and craftsmen who serve for limited periods before returning to their fields. They fight bravely but lack the cohesion and experience of professional Viking warbands. Worse, they are predictable. The Vikings have learned to avoid pitched battles, to scatter when the FYRD assembles, to return the moment the farmers must go home to plant or harvest. The traditional Saxon strategy is failing because the nature of war itself has changed. The Vikings are not invaders in the old sense. They are colonizers. They bring their families, establish settlements, integrate captured territories into a growing Scandinavian empire. Every year, the Danelaw, as the Viking-controlled territory becomes known, grows larger. Every year, Wessex grows smaller. And now, in the winter of 878, the wolves have come for Alfred himself. The Viking king Guthrum has launched a surprise attack during the sacred Christmas season, when Anglo-Saxon custom dictates that warfare should cease. It is a brutal lesson in the futility of honoring old rules against an enemy who recognizes no such constraints. Alfred's court at Chippenham is overrun in a single night. The king barely escapes with his life. In the marshes, watching his breath fog in the cold air, Alfred understands something his predecessors did not. The Vikings cannot be beaten by matching their tactics. English forces cannot outraid the raiders. They cannot match Scandinavian mobility or professional warrior culture. To survive, to win, requires something entirely new. Not just a new tactic, but a new kind of warfare. A strategic revolution. What Alfred begins to conceive in those desperate weeks, huddled in the Somerset wetlands, is not merely a military reform. It is a reimagining of what a kingdom can be. A system that will turn Wessex's apparent weaknesses into strengths. A weapon forged not from iron, but from organization itself. But first, he must survive. And the Vikings are hunting him. The marshes offer concealment, but they cannot hide a king forever. Time is running out. Guthrum stands on the ramparts of Chippenham, surveying his latest conquest with the satisfaction of a man who has turned winning into an art form. The Anglo-Saxons call him a barbarian, but there is nothing crude about the way he makes war. For 2 decades, he has carved his name into English soil with calculated precision, transforming from a minor Danish jarl into one of the most powerful warlords in Britain. His rise mirrors the evolution of Viking strategy itself. Where earlier generations raided for silver and slaves, Guthrum raids for territory. Where his predecessors burned monasteries and vanished, he captures cities and stays. His great army is not merely a war band but a colonization force, complete with craftsmen, farmers, and families waiting in secured territories for work. But Guthrum is not a man who leaves things to chance. He knows Alfred's reputation. This is not some weak-willed nobleman who will simply surrender and accept baptism in exchange for a minor title. Alfred is educated, cunning, a man who has studied Roman military history and understands strategy in ways that make him dangerous even in defeat. Perhaps especially in defeat. So Guthrum does something that reveals the sophistication of Viking political warfare. He begins to negotiate. Messengers are sent into the marshes under flags of truce. The terms are generous, almost unbelievably so. Alfred can keep a reduced Wessex, a client kingdom under Viking overlordship. His people will be spared. All he must do is bend the knee. It is a trap, of course, but a clever one. If Alfred accepts, he legitimizes Viking rule and becomes a puppet. If he refuses, his continued resistance becomes a personal vendetta rather than a righteous defense of his kingdom, making it harder to rally support. Either way, Guthrum wins. In the marshes, Alfred receives these offers with grim amusement. He knows Guthrum's game because he has been studying Viking methods since he was a boy. Alfred is that rarity among medieval rulers, a genuine intellectual who believes knowledge is a weapon as sharp as any sword. He has translated Latin texts. He has interviewed Viking prisoners. He has analyzed every defeat his kingdom has suffered, looking for patterns, for weaknesses to exploit. And in the long, cold nights of his exile, surrounded by the handful of thanes who have remained loyal, Alfred begins to share a vision that seems almost mad in its ambition. He does not speak of simply surviving or even of defeating Guthrum's army. He speaks of fundamentally restructuring how Wessex defends itself, of creating a military system that can match Viking mobility, of building fortifications that can protect civilians even when the king and his army are elsewhere, of establishing a navy that can contest Viking control of the waters. His closest advisors listen with a mixture of hope and skepticism. These ideas require resources Wessex no longer has, time they do not possess, and most critically, they require Alfred to still be king of something more than a few square miles of frozen marsh. But the king is undeterred. He sends out his own messengers, not to negotiate but to summon. Secret riders slip through Viking patrols, carrying word to the shires of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The message is simple: the king lives. The fight continues. Assemble your FYRDS. In spring we strike. It is a desperate gamble. Alfred is betting that enough Saxons remain unwilling to accept Viking rule, that the traditional FYRD system he plans to revolutionize can be mobilized one more time. He is betting his life, his kingdom, and the future of England itself on a single throw of the dice. The Vikings have numbers, position, and momentum. Alfred has nothing but a plan and the grim determination of a man with nothing left to lose. In the Game of Thrones they are playing, someone is about to discover they have. Spring comes slowly to Somerset in 879, but when it arrives, something moves through the villages and farmsteads of Wessex that the Vikings do not expect. Not an army. Not yet. But the whisper of one. A rumor that grows louder with each passing day. The king lives. Alfred is calling his people to war. The response reveals something the Vikings have consistently underestimated about Saxon England. For all its apparent weakness, for all the defeats and burned cities and conquered territories, there exists a bedrock of resistance that conquest cannot erase. These are people who have lived under the threat of Viking raids for generations. They have buried their children, watched their homes burn, seen their churches desecrated. And they are tired of running. But mobilizing a medieval army is not like flipping a switch. The FYRD system, for all its flaws, is built on feudal obligations that have been established over centuries. Each shire has its designated muster point. Each thane knows how many men he must bring. Each free man knows his obligation to serve. The problem is time. Traditionally, the FYRD assembles slowly, over weeks, giving enemies advance warning and time to respond. Alfred needs speed. He needs surprise. He needs to strike before Guthrum fully comprehends that the hunted king has become a hunter. So in the hidden reaches of the Somerset marshes, at a place called Athelney, Alfred establishes a fortified camp. It is a small thing, more of a defended refuge than a true fortress, but it serves a critical purpose. It gives his assembling forces a rallying point that the Vikings cannot easily attack through the treacherous wetlands. And more importantly, it allows Alfred to train his men in the new way of warfare he has been conceptualizing. What emerges in those spring weeks is something unprecedented in Saxon military history. Alfred drills his forces in rapid deployment and coordinated movement. He organizes them into smaller, more flexible units rather than the traditional shield wall formations. He establishes supply lines and intelligence networks, sending scouts to track Viking movements with systematic precision. Most critically, he begins to integrate the lessons of Roman military organization that he has studied in ancient texts, adapting them to the realities of 9th-century warfare. The Romans, Alfred understood, had conquered half the world not through individual warrior prowess but through system and organization. Their legions were not collections of heroes but machines of war, where every man knew his role and training could overcome even superior numbers or individual skill. Could such methods work against the Vikings? Alfred intends to find out. By early May, approximately 4,000 men have assembled at Athelney. It is not the massive army that once defended Wessex, but it is enough. More importantly, these are men who have chosen to come. The Vikings have offered peace, have offered the Guthrum, meanwhile, has grown comfortable. His forces are dispersed across Wessex, securing territory and enjoying the spoils of conquest. Spring has brought warm weather and the pleasures of success. Intelligence reports suggest the Vikings are planning to move additional forces into Wessex to consolidate control, but they are in no hurry. As far as Guthrum knows, Alfred is either dead or hiding, his support crumbling, his kingdom finished. It is precisely the miscalculation Alfred has been hoping for. On May 6, 878, the Saxon army emerges from the marshes. They move not as a slow, ponderous FYRD, but as organized units covering ground with surprising speed. Their destination is Egbert Stone, an ancient monument on the border of Wiltshire. It is both a practical muster point and a symbolic one, named for Alfred's grandfather who first unified Wessex. The message is clear: the kingdom is rising. The fight is not over. When the FYRDS of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire converge at Egbert Stone, they find their king waiting for them. Not the broken fugitive of winter, but a commander with a plan and the will to execute it. The Vikings are about to learn that the war they thought was won has only just begun. The appearance of a full Saxon army catches Guthrum completely off guard. His intelligence network, which has served him well for years, has failed him at the critical moment. The Vikings believed Alfred was finished, his support evaporated, his cause hopeless. Instead, thousands of Saxon warriors are suddenly marching through Wiltshire under the banner of a king who was supposed to be dead or irrelevant. The Viking response is predictably swift. Guthrum begins calling in his dispersed forces, summoning jarls from across conquered Wessex to assemble for battle. But here the weakness of the Viking position reveals itself. For all their military prowess, they are occupiers in hostile territory. Their forces are scattered across multiple strongholds. Their supply lines are extended. And Alfred has seized the initiative. The Saxon army moves toward Chippenham, but not to besiege it. Alfred has studied enough Roman military history to know that sieges are slow, costly affairs that favor the defender. Instead, he does something unexpected. He positions his army at Edington, a few miles from Chippenham, in a carefully chosen defensive position on high ground. Then he waits. It is a calculated provocation. Alfred knows Guthrum's nature. The Viking warlord is aggressive, confident, accustomed to winning. He will not sit behind walls while a Saxon army camps on his doorstep. He will come out to fight. And when he does, he will be fighting on ground of Alfred's choosing. The Battle of Edington begins on a spring morning with the Vikings advancing uphill against Saxon positions. It is the kind of straight-up fight that both sides understand, the traditional clash of shield walls that has decided Germanic conflicts for centuries. The Vikings expect their professional warriors to break the Saxon line as they have broken so many others. They have numbers roughly equal to Alfred's force, perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 men on each side. They have experience and confidence. What they do not have is the advantage they are accustomed to. For once, the Vikings cannot maneuver around the enemy. They cannot use their superior mobility. They cannot choose when and where to fight. They must come to Alfred, and they must do it on his terms. The battle is vicious and prolonged, lasting most of the day. The Saxon shield wall holds, its warriors fighting with the desperation of men defending their last free kingdom. But more than desperation drives them. Alfred has positioned his forces carefully, using terrain to neutralize Viking advantages. He has organized his men into rotating lines, allowing fresh troops to replace exhausted ones while maintaining the integrity of the formation. He has kept reserves to exploit any breakthrough, rather than committing everything to the initial clash. These are not revolutionary tactics by later medieval standards, but against Viking forces accustomed to facing disorganized Saxon levies, they are devastatingly effective. The Vikings crash against the Saxon line like waves against a cliff, and for the first time in years, the cliff does not break. As the afternoon wears on, something shifts in the battle. The Vikings, sensing their attacks are failing, begin to lose cohesion. Gaps appear in their formation. Their assault becomes ragged, individual warbands fighting separate battles rather than a coordinated force executing a unified plan. And into these gaps, Alfred sends his reserved forces. The Viking line buckles, then breaks. What begins as an organized retreat rapidly deteriorates into a rout. Guthrum's army flees back toward Chippenham with Saxon forces in pursuit. It is the first decisive Saxon victory over a Viking army in years, and its psychological impact is immense. But Alfred does something that demonstrates the strategic sophistication that will make him legendary. Rather than pursuing the fleeing Vikings into a potentially costly assault on Chippenham's fortifications, he surrounds the town and settles in for a siege. He has learned from past mistakes. He will not waste his hard-won victory in a hasty attack that plays to enemy strengths. Inside Chippenham, Guthrum stares at the Saxon. Chippenham becomes a prison. For 2 weeks, Guthrum's once mighty army sits behind walls they cannot defend forever, surrounded by an enemy they cannot defeat in the field. The Vikings have food, but it will not last indefinitely. They have warriors, but morale is crumbling. They have fortifications, but no hope of relief. Alfred's siege is not a passive affair. He understands that time is both his ally and his enemy. Each day the siege continues strengthens his position politically, demonstrating to all of England that the Vikings can be beaten. But each day also risks allowing other Viking forces to assemble and march to Guthrum's relief. The window of opportunity is finite. So Alfred applies pressure systematically. His forces cut off all supply routes into Chippenham. They intercept messengers trying to slip out to summon help. They conduct raids against Viking positions throughout the region, collapsing the infrastructure of conquest that Guthrum has spent years building. This is not merely a siege of one town, but a coordinated campaign to break Viking power throughout Wessex. Inside the walls, Guthrum faces a decision he has never had to make before. Surrender. The word tastes like ash in his mouth. He has spent 2 decades building his reputation as a conqueror, a warlord who takes what he wants and answers to no man. Surrender means not just personal humiliation but the collapse of everything he has built. Yet the alternatives are worse. He can attempt a breakout, but Alfred's forces hold the high ground and the element of surprise. A desperate charge would likely end in massacre. He can wait for relief, but intelligence suggests that other Viking jarls are reluctant to march into what increasingly looks like a trap. He can hold out and hope that Alfred's army disintegrates as Saxon fyrds traditionally do when the planting season arrives, but Alfred shows no signs of easing the pressure. On the 14th day of the siege, Guthrum sends envoys to negotiate. Not surrender exactly. Viking pride will not allow that language, but an armistice. A settlement. Terms. What happens next will echo through history for over 1,000 years. Alfred could demand unconditional surrender. He could execute Guthrum and his jarls as invaders and oath-breakers. He could take revenge for all the burned villages and slaughtered civilians. Medieval justice would support any of these actions. Instead, Alfred does something that reveals the true nature of his secret weapon. He offers Guthrum a deal that transforms enemies into something else entirely. Not friends, that would be naive, but something that might, in time, become neighbors. The terms are straightforward but revolutionary. Guthrum and his army will leave Wessex. They will withdraw to East Anglia, which they already control, and recognize a formal border between Viking and Saxon territory. But here is the critical element. Guthrum and his leading jarls will accept Christian baptism. Alfred himself will stand as Guthrum's godfather in the ceremony. To modern ears, this might sound like a purely religious gesture, but in the 9th century, it is a diplomatic masterstroke. By entering into a godfather-godson relationship with Guthrum, Alfred is creating a kinship bond that carries legal and social weight in both Christian and Germanic culture. He is transforming a military victory into a political settlement that gives Guthrum a face-saving way to accept defeat while creating a framework for future peaceful coexistence. More importantly, by insisting on baptism and the formal recognition of borders, Alfred is doing something no Saxon ruler has managed before. He is drawing a line. On one side, Saxon England. On the other, the Danelaw. Not a temporary truce that will collapse with the next raiding season, but a permanent partition that acknowledges reality while protecting what remains of independent Saxon territory. Guthrum accepts. Perhaps because he has no choice. Perhaps because he recognizes that Alfred is offering him something valuable: legitimacy. A transformation from warlord to king, from invader to ruler of a recognized realm. 3 weeks after the Battle of Edington, in a ceremony at Uller near Athelney, one of the most feared Viking commanders in England kneels before a Saxon king and accepts baptism. He takes a Christian name, Athelstan. Alfred stands beside him as godfather, his hand on Guthrum's shoulder. It is theater, of course. But it is also something more. It is the moment when conquest becomes negotiation. And negotiation, Alfred knows, is how you win wars that cannot be won by arms alone. The Treaty of Wedmore, as the agreement with Guthrum becomes known, gives Alfred breathing room. But he understands that a treaty is only as strong as the power that enforces it. For all the symbolic importance of Guthrum's baptism, the fundamental strategic problem remains. Viking forces still hold vast swathes of England. New raiders still arrive each year from Scandinavia. The longships that brought Guthrum's army can bring others. Alfred needs his secret weapon. Not the one that won at Edington, courage and clever tactics, but the one that will win the next 10 battles before they even begin. He needs to change the game itself. In the months following the treaty, Alfred begins implementing a system of fortifications unlike anything Saxon England has seen. He calls them buzz. They are not castles in the Norman sense that will come 2 centuries later. They are fortified towns, each positioned no more than 20 miles from its neighbors, creating a network that covers all of Wessex. The genius is not in any individual fortification but in the system they create together. The concept is derived from Alfred's study of Roman and Byzantine military organization, but adapted to the specific challenge of Viking warfare. Each bus serves multiple purposes. It is a garrison for permanent troops. It is a refuge where local populations can shelter during raids. It is a supply depot and administrative center. Most critically, it is positioned to ensure that no Viking force can move through Wessex without coming within striking distance of a fortified position manned by troops ready to respond. Building this network is an immense undertaking. It requires reorganizing the entire economy. Alfred establishes the Burghall Heidage, a detailed document that specifies which lands must contribute to the building and maintenance of each burh, calculated with mathematical precision based on the length of walls that must be defended. Every hide of land, roughly enough to support one family, owes specific obligations: labor for construction, men for garrison duty, supplies for provisioning. The system is revolutionary because it solves the fundamental problem that has plagued Saxon defense for decades. When Vikings raid, farmers cannot abandon their fields to form a FYRD without risking starvation. But if the Vikings come, farmers die or flee anyway. Alfred's solution is to create permanent defensive infrastructure that protects the agricultural base while maintaining a ready response force. But the buzz are only half of the secret weapon. Alfred also reforms the FYRD itself, creating a rotation system where half the eligible men serve at any given time while the other half work their lands. This provides a standing army without destroying the economy. He establishes requirements for equipment and training, turning the FYRD from a mob of farmers with spears into an organized military force. More controversially, he begins to build a navy. This shocks the conservative nobility of Wessex, who see shipbuilding as an enormous expense for uncertain benefit. But Alfred has studied the problem of Viking mobility obsessively. As long as Scandinavian longships can strike anywhere along England's coast or navigate its rivers unopposed, the strategic initiative belongs to the raiders. A Saxon navy cannot match the Viking ship for ship, but it does not need to. It merely needs to contest their complete freedom of movement, to create enough uncertainty that raiding becomes riskier and less profitable. The ships Alfred builds are larger than Viking longships, designed more for combat than for raiding. They carry 60 oars rather than the typical Viking 30 to 40. They are, in essence, floating fortresses designed to blockade river mouths and defend key ports. They are expensive and not entirely successful in their early deployments, but they establish a principle. England's defense cannot be purely land-based. All of this, the buzz, the reformed FYRD, the Navy, requires money. Enormous amounts of money. Alfred raises it through a combination of taxation, church contributions, and the reorganization of royal lands. He makes himself unpopular with portions of the nobility who see their traditional autonomy eroded by these demands. But he persists because he understands something they do not. The Vikings have not gone away. Guthrum has kept the treaty, but there are other Viking armies in Northumbria and East Anglia. New raiders from Scandinavia probe Wessex's defenses regularly. The victory at Edington has bought time, not safety. And time, Alfred knows, is what his secret weapon needs to mature. Because the real weapon is not any individual fort or ship or reformed fighting force. The weapon is the system itself. The transformation of Wessex from a kingdom into something new. Something that can defend itself. The first real test of Alfred's defensive network comes in 885, 7 years after Edington. A massive Viking fleet arrives from the continent, fresh from raiding in Francia and looking for easier pickings. They number over 200 ships, carrying thousands of warriors under the command of the Danish warlord Hastion, a legendary raider whose name is spoken with fear from Ireland to the Mediterranean. Hastion surveys the English coast and makes a calculated decision. He will attack Rochester, a strategically vital town in Kent that controls access to the Thames and London. If he can take Rochester, he can use it as a base to strike deep into southern England, bypassing much of Alfred's defensive system. It is classic Viking strategy. Identify the weak point, strike fast, establish a foothold, then expand. What Hastion does not fully appreciate is how much has changed in 7 years. Rochester is not an undefended Saxon town. It is a burh. Its walls have been rebuilt according to specifications in Alfred's Burghall Heidage. Its garrison is trained, equipped, and maintained through the systematic contributions of surrounding territories. Most importantly, it is not alone. When Hastion's forces besiege Rochester, messengers ride out within hours to neighboring Buzz. Alfred, now governing from Winchester, receives word within a day. And here the true genius of his system reveals itself. He does not need to raise a FYRD from scratch, a process that would take weeks. His standing forces are already partially mobilized, rotating through garrison duty. He simply redirects those already under arms toward Rochester while calling up additional units. The Saxon response is swift and coordinated in a way that would have been impossible a decade earlier. Forces converge on Rochester from multiple Buzz, using the road network that Alfred has maintained and improved specifically for rapid military response. Within 3 days of the siege beginning, a substantial Saxon army is approaching Rochester. Hastion, accustomed to the slow, predictable Saxon responses of earlier decades, is caught off guard. His forces are committed to the siege, his ships beached and vulnerable. The Viking warlord makes a quick calculation. He can win the siege eventually, but not before Alfred's forces arrive in strength. He can turn and fight Alfred's army, but that means abandoning the siege and fighting on ground not of his choosing. Or he can withdraw to his ships and seek a better opportunity elsewhere. He chooses withdrawal. Not because he fears Alfred's army in open battle. Vikings still have confidence in their warrior prowess, but because the network of Buzz has done exactly what it was designed to do: deny the Vikings the easy victories that made raiding profitable. Over the following months, Hastion's fleet probes other points along the coast. Each time, they find fortified positions and rapid responses. Finally, frustrated and having suffered losses for minimal gain, Hastion leads his fleet back to Francia. The message spreads through the Viking world: Wessex is no longer an easy target. But Alfred is not satisfied with defense alone. He begins to push back, extending his system into territories the Vikings have abandoned or defending weakly. He rebuilds London, which has sat partially ruined since Viking attacks decades earlier, transforming it into a major and trading center. He establishes fortifications in the borderlands between Wessex and the Danelaw, not to conquer Viking territory but to create a buffer zone and demonstrate Saxon strength. More importantly, Alfred begins projecting power beyond Wessex's borders. Other Saxon kingdoms, what remains of Mercia, the scattered resistance in Wales, begin to look to Wessex not just for military assistance but for a model of how to survive in the Viking Age. Alfred sends advisors to help build fortifications. He arranges marriages between Saxon ruling families to create alliances. He positions himself not merely as King of Wessex but as the leader of all Anglo-Saxons resisting Scandinavian conquest. It is empire-building, but of a subtle kind. Alfred cannot conquer the other Saxon territories. He lacks the military strength and they are too proud to submit. But he can make himself indispensable. He can become the center around which Saxon resistance organizes. And organization, as always, is Alfred's true genius. While Buzz and reformed FYRDS defend Wessex militarily, Alfred wages a second campaign that historians will eventually recognize as equally important. It is a war of ideas, fought with parchment and ink rather than swords and shields. It is a campaign to answer a question that haunts him: what is England? Before the Viking invasions, the question would have seemed absurd. England was a collection of separate kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, Kent, sharing a common language and religion but with distinct identities and often warring among themselves. The idea of England as a single political entity did not exist. But the Vikings have inadvertently changed this. By conquering most of the island, they have created a situation where all remaining Saxon territories share a common enemy and a common interest in survival. Alfred sees an opportunity in this catastrophe. He begins to articulate and promote the concept of the Anglo-Saxons as a unified people with a shared identity and destiny. This is not merely propaganda, though it serves that purpose. Alfred genuinely believes that cultural and intellectual strength is necessary for political survival. He fears that Viking conquest brings not just political domination but cultural extinction, the replacement of Saxon Christian civilization with pagan Scandinavian culture. In his mind, defending England means defending not just territory but learning, law, and faith. So he becomes a patron of education and literature on an unprecedented scale. He establishes a palace school where young nobles are taught to read Latin and English. He commissions translations of essential Latin texts into English, often participating in the translation work himself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year historical record, is compiled under his sponsorship and distributed to monasteries across the kingdom. It serves multiple purposes: preserving history, promoting literacy, and subtly advancing Alfred's political narrative of Wessex as the legitimate leader of Saxon resistance. Alfred's Code of Laws, compiled around 890, is another component of this intellectual campaign. It draws on earlier Saxon law codes but organizes them systematically and adds provisions that reflect Alfred's Christian education and his vision of just governance. The code begins with the Ten Commandments and selections from biblical law, explicitly connecting Saxon legal tradition to broader Christian civilization. It establishes rights and obligations across social classes, creating a legal framework that binds the kingdom together. But perhaps most importantly, Alfred promotes literacy among his nobles and administrators. He believes that effective governance requires educated officials who can read orders, maintain records, and administer justice based on written law rather than mere custom. This is radically innovative for 9th-century Europe, where literacy is typically confined to clergy. The Vikings, for all their military sophistication, have no comparable intellectual infrastructure. They have oral traditions, skilled craftsmen, and sophisticated trading networks, but they lack the written administrative systems that allow complex societies to function across large territories. Alfred understands that this is both a weakness he can exploit and a strength he must preserve in Saxon culture. His translation program focuses on works he considers most necessary for all men to know. These include Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Augustine's Soliloquies, Gregory's Pastoral Care, and Bede's Ecclesiastical History. The selection is deliberate. These texts teach Christian philosophy, provide models of good governance, and reinforce Saxon historical identity. They are weapons in a cultural war for the soul of England. Critics, both in Alfred's time and later, question whether this intellectual program is practical when Vikings are literally at the gates. Would not resources be better spent on more soldiers, more ships, more fortifications? But Alfred grasps something profound. Military strength without cultural coherence is temporary. The Vikings can be beaten in battle, but if Saxon culture dies, if learning vanishes, if identity fragments, then the victory is hollow. He is building something designed to outlast him. A kingdom that can defend itself not just militarily but culturally, that can absorb shocks and invasions and emerge with its essential character intact. The buzz will stand for decades or centuries. But ideas, properly planted, can last forever. In the courts of Wessex, a new generation grows up that can read, that knows its history, that understands itself as part of a larger Saxon civilization worth defending. They are being trained not just as warriors, but as inheritors of a culture that Alfred has deliberately shaped and preserved. When these young nobles take power, they will not simply fight Vikings. They will fight for England, a concept Alfred is creating in real time. And this, perhaps more than any military victory, is Alfred's greatest accomplishment. He is inventing a nation from the ruins of conquest. He is turning a collection of terrified kingdoms into a people with a shared identity and purpose. But ideas, no matter how powerful, cannot defeat armies alone. The military and cultural campaigns must work together, each reinforcing the other. A literate administration makes the best system more efficient. A secure kingdom gives scholars the peace necessary to work. Victories in battle give credibility to Alfred's claim to leadership. Legal reforms strengthen social cohesion, which strengthens military effectiveness. It is all one system, all one weapon. And it is beginning to change England forever. The years following 885 bring something England has not experienced in decades: relative peace. The term is relative because Viking raids never entirely cease, but they decrease dramatically in frequency and intensity. Hastion's withdrawal sends a message throughout the Scandinavian world. Wessex is fortified, organized, and dangerous. Easier targets exist elsewhere. Guthrum, now ruling East Anglia as King Athelstan, keeps his treaty with Alfred. The two men, godfather and godson, maintain a working relationship that, while never warm, remains functional. The border between Wessex and the Danelaw becomes a genuine frontier, with trade and diplomatic contact alongside occasional tension. It is not peace, exactly, but it is not the existential war of earlier decades. Alfred uses this breathing space to consolidate his reforms. The BA system expands and improves. The navy, while never large enough to challenge Viking sea power completely, becomes more effective through experience. The reformed FYRD proves its worth repeatedly in border skirmishes and in repelling the smaller raiding parties that still probe for weakness. But peace has costs that war does not. The extraordinary taxation and labor obligations required to maintain Alfred's defensive system become harder to justify when Viking longships are not burning villages. Nobles who contributed willingly during existential crisis begin to grumble about the permanent garrison duty, about the maintenance requirements for fortifications, about the king's interference in local affairs through his legal reforms and literacy requirements. Alfred faces a challenge different from, but no less serious than military defeat. He must convince a generation that has known relative security that the system protecting them must be maintained. The human tendency is to relax when danger recedes, to assume that this year's peace means permanent safety, to resent the costs of defense when the threat seems abstract. The king responds with a combination of political skill and raw stubbornness. He ties the BA system to economic benefits, encouraging trade and craft production in fortified towns. Markets flourish behind defended walls. Merchants discover that the security Alfred provides makes commerce more profitable. The BAs become not just military installations but economic engines, creating constituencies who benefit from their existence beyond pure defense. He also uses his legal code to create a more coherent governance system that makes royal power less arbitrary and more institutional. Nobles may resent some of Alfred's demands, but they also appreciate the stability his laws provide. Inheritance disputes are resolved through written law rather than blood feuds. Property rights are codified and protected. The king's peace becomes valuable in itself, not just as protection from Vikings but as a framework for prosperity. Still, there is resistance. Some nobles, particularly in outlying areas, see Alfred's reforms as centralizing power at their expense. They are not wrong. The king is indeed reducing aristocratic autonomy, replacing it with a more organized state that answers to Winchester rather than to local lordships. Traditional prerogatives are being systematically eroded in the name of efficiency and security. Alfred navigates these tensions with a combination of force, persuasion, and patience. He is willing to compromise on details while remaining adamant about fundamentals. The BA system will continue. The reformed FYRD will be maintained. The legal code will be enforced. On these points, he does not yield. But he also knows when to give ground. He allows local administration to remain in noble hands where that does not threaten royal authority. He distributes honors and lands to reward cooperation. He arranges marriages strategically to bind powerful families to the crown. He is building loyalty not just through force but through interest, making the success of his system synonymous with the success of those who implement it. In 892, the long peace ends. A massive Viking force, the largest since Guthrum's invasion, arrives from Francia. These are not raiders but a migration army, over 300 ships carrying warriors and their families, driven from the continent by the aggressive defense of Frankish King Charles the Fat. They are desperate, hungry, and dangerous. They look at England and see opportunity. The memory of easy conquests from decades past, they have no idea what they are about to encounter. Alfred's system has had 14 years to mature. The BAs are stronger. The FYRD is better trained. The Navy is more experienced. And most importantly, A generation of Saxons has grown up under Alfred's reforms, taught to see themselves as English, trained to fight as organized units rather than individual warriors, believing in the idea that England can be defended. The Vikings are about to discover that the war they think they are starting ended years ago. They just did not know it yet. The Viking army that lands in England in 892 is unlike anything Alfred has faced since Edington. They are commanded by Hastion, the same warlord who withdrew from Rochester years earlier, now leading a coalition of desperate Scandinavian jarls who have been forced from their bases in Francia. They number perhaps 15,000 warriors, with families and support personnel swelling the total to over 40,000 people. This is not a raiding party. This is a migration. Hastion's strategy is sophisticated. Rather than attack Wessex directly, he establishes two fortified camps, one in Kent and another in the Thames estuary. From these bases, he can raid in multiple directions while his forces rest and resupply. He sends diplomatic messages to the Viking rulers of Northumbria and East Anglia, seeking alliance or at least neutrality. His goal is to avoid fighting all of Saxon England simultaneously, to exploit divisions and strike where resistance is weakest. It is exactly the kind of strategic thinking that would have succeeded 20 years earlier. But England in 892 is not the England of 870. Alfred's response demonstrates how completely his system has transformed Saxon defense. Rather than trying to raise a massive FYRD to confront the entire Viking force, which would take weeks and leave other regions vulnerable, Alfred implements a coordinated response using his network of buzz. He positions forces to shadow the Viking army, harassing their foraging parties and preventing them from establishing secure supply lines. He uses his navy to contest river access, limiting Viking mobility. He sends urgent messages to Mercia, which his son-in-law Athelred rules as a client kingdom, coordinating their forces with his own. Most importantly, he protects the civilian population. When Vikings approach, people retreat behind walls with their livestock and portable goods. The invaders find not helpless villages but defended fortifications and scorched earth. Raiding becomes unprofitable. The massive Viking army, which requires enormous supplies daily, begins to strain under logistical pressure. For 4 years, the war grinds on. The Vikings are not defeated in a single decisive battle like Edington. Instead, they are worn down through systematic opposition. Every raid meets resistance. Every attempt to establish a secure base is contested. The Viking force fragments, with different jarls trying different strategies, none successful. Hastion attempts to march through Wessex to the Severn estuary, hoping to link up with Vikings in Wales. Alfred's forces shadow him the entire way, avoiding pitched battle but preventing effective foraging. The Viking army arrives at the Severn starving and exhausted. They fortify a position at Buttington, intending to rest and resupply. Instead, they find themselves besieged by combined forces from Wessex, Mercia, and even some Welsh kingdoms who fear Viking settlement more than they hate Saxons. The siege at Buttington becomes a turning point. The Vikings are trapped without supplies, surrounded by enemies who have learned not to assault fortified positions but to simply wait. After weeks, the starving Viking force attempts a breakout. The resulting battle is a slaughter. Those who survive flee back toward their bases in Kent, harried every step of the way. Other Viking contingents try different approaches. Some raid into Mercia, where they are similarly frustrated by fortified buzz and coordinated resistance. Some sail up the Thames, only to be blocked by fortifications Alfred has built at key crossing points. Some attempt to settle in East Anglia, but Guthrum, still honoring his treaty despite pressure from his jarls, refuses them sanctuary. By 896, the great Viking army is disintegrating. Some warriors settle in Northumbria or East Anglia, accepting that conquest has failed and choosing to become farmers in the Danelaw rather than continue the feudal struggle. Some return to Francia or Scandinavia, spreading word that England is no longer a profitable target. Hasty himself withdraws to France, his reputation damaged, his army scattered. Alfred's victory is not the dramatic triumph of Edington. There is no single climactic battle, no enemy king kneeling in surrender. Instead, there is the slow, methodical demonstration that Viking conquest of Wessex is impossible. The system has worked. The secret weapon has proven itself against the greatest test it would face in Alfred's lifetime. But the cost has been enormous. 4 years of warfare have strained Wessex's resources and tested its social cohesion. Alfred himself is aging rapidly, his health deteriorating from a lifetime of stress and a chronic illness that medieval medicine cannot cure. He is in constant pain, exhausted, aware that his time is limited. Yet he cannot rest, because he knows that military victory means nothing if the system dies with him. His final years must be devoted to ensuring that what he has built will survive his death. The greatest test is still to come, not against Vikings, but against time itself. In his final years, Alfred becomes obsessed with succession. Not just the transfer of his crown to his son Edward, but the continuation of the entire system he has created. He has seen too many medieval kingdoms collapse after a strong ruler's death, their reforms abandoned, their innovations forgotten. He will not allow this to happen to England. Edward, Alfred's eldest son, has been carefully trained for kingship. Unlike his father, who came to power during crisis, Edward has grown up in the reformed system. He has commanded forces in the network. He has studied his father's translations. He has participated in diplomatic negotiations with Danish rulers. He knows both the military and administrative aspects of defending England. But knowledge is not enough. Edward must have legitimacy that goes beyond simple inheritance. Alfred needs his son to be accepted not just as King of Wessex but as the leader of all Anglo-Saxons. This requires political maneuvering of extraordinary delicacy. Alfred's daughter Ethelflaed is married to Athelred, the ruler of Mercia. This is not merely a diplomatic marriage but a strategic partnership. Ethelflaed, educated in her father's court, understands the best system and the importance of coordinated defense. She works with her husband to extend Alfred's reforms into Mercia, building fortifications and organizing military forces along Wessex lines. The alliance between Wessex and Mercia becomes the foundation for a broader Saxon unity. Alfred also cultivates relationships with lesser Saxon kingdoms and even some Welsh rulers. He positions himself as the protector of all Christian kingdoms in Britain against pagan Vikings. It is propaganda, but effective propaganda based on genuine military success. When Saxon territories face Viking pressure, they increasingly look to Winchester for leadership. In these final years, Alfred also codifies his administrative innovations. He establishes clear procedures for maintaining the best system, specifying exactly which lands owe what obligations. He formalizes the rotation system for the FYRD, ensuring that military obligations are predictable and sustainable. He creates a royal household bureaucracy capable of implementing these systems after his death. The writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle becomes increasingly important. This is not just history but political instruction, a text that will teach future generations what England is and what it means to defend it. The Chronicle presents Alfred not as an individual hero but as the architect of a system, subtly emphasizing that the system matters more than any one man. Alfred's legal code is expanded and refined. He draws increasingly on biblical precedent and Roman law, positioning himself as a Christian king in a tradition that extends back to Constantine and Charlemagne. This is deliberate myth-making, creating a narrative of continuity and legitimacy that will outlast him. But even as he secures his legacy politically and administratively, Alfred cannot stop the deterioration of his own body. The chronic illness that has plagued him for decades worsens. Contemporary sources suggest it may have been Crohn's disease or some other digestive disorder, though medieval medicine cannot diagnose or treat it effectively. He is in constant pain, frequently unable to eat, visibly aging beyond his years. Yet he continues to work. There are buzz to inspect, disputes to settle, translations to complete. He drives himself with the knowledge that every day he lives is another day to strengthen the system that must survive him. His nobles beg him to rest. His physicians prescribe various useless remedies. Alfred ignores them all. There is too much work remaining. In October of 899, Alfred dies at Winchester. He is 50 years old but looks ancient, worn out by a lifetime of warfare, illness, and ceaseless labor. His death is mourned throughout Saxon England and even, remarkably, by some in the Danelaw who have come to respect the man who transformed their enemy from victims into worthy opponents. Edward succeeds him smoothly. The system Alfred built does not collapse or even falter significantly. The buzz continue to function. The FYRD musters as required. The legal code remains in force. The Navy patrols the coasts. The cultural program of education and literacy continues. It is the ultimate validation of Alfred's vision. The secret weapon was never just military innovation or clever tactics. It was the creation of a system robust enough to survive the loss of its creator. A kingdom that could defend itself even when the king was gone. But Alfred's legacy extends far beyond his own lifetime. The system he built becomes the foundation for something unprecedented in English history. The reconquest of the Danelaw. The unification of England. The birth of a nation. The story does not end with Alfred's death. In many ways, it is only beginning. Because the secret weapon Alfred forged is not a static defense but a platform for expansion. His son Edward and daughter Ethelflaed will use the BEA system not merely to defend Saxon territory but to systematically reconquer the Danelaw over the next 3 decades. The process is methodical, almost mathematical. They build a BEA deep in contested territory, garrison it heavily, and wait. Vikings can attack the BEA, but assaulting fortified positions is costly and often fails. They can ignore it, but then Saxon forces raid from the fortification, making the surrounding territory ungovernable. Or they can withdraw, ceding territory to Saxon control. Slowly, relentlessly, the frontier moves north and east. Ethelflaed proves to be a military commander of exceptional ability. She builds fortifications at Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, and a dozen other strategic locations, each positioned to project power into Viking-held Mercia. She leads armies personally, earns the loyalty of Mercia. Edward pushes into East Anglia and Essex, using the same systematic approach. He does not seek glorious victories in pitched battle, though those occur when necessary. Instead, he builds fortifications, establishes administration, and consolidates control before moving to the next objective. It is unsexy warfare, but it is devastatingly effective. By 918, when Ethelflaed dies and Edward annexes Mercia directly, the Danelaw is fragmenting. Some Viking jarls accept Saxon overlordship. Others flee to Northumbria. A few fight on, but without the territorial depth to sustain prolonged resistance. The map of England is being redrawn. Edward's son Athelstan will complete the process, conquering York in 927 and finally uniting all of England under a single Saxon king. It is the fulfillment of everything Alfred worked toward, achieved barely 3 decades after his death. England, as a unified kingdom, is born from the system one desperate king created in a marsh. But the legacy extends beyond mere territorial conquest. The BAS system evolves into the network of towns and cities that will define medieval England. The legal code Alfred compiled becomes the foundation of English common law. The administrative innovations he pioneered create a governmental structure more sophisticated than most European kingdoms will achieve for centuries. The cultural program of education and literacy produces a literate ruling class unique in early medieval Europe. Most importantly, Alfred's idea of England, of a unified Anglo-Saxon people with a shared identity and destiny, becomes reality. The concept he articulated and promoted takes root. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continues to be copied and distributed, spreading a common historical narrative. The language, the laws, the culture that Alfred fought to preserve become the bedrock of English identity for centuries to come. When William the Conqueror invades in 1066, he conquers a unified English kingdom, not a collection of warring principalities. The very existence of that kingdom is Alfred's legacy. The Norman conquest itself is only possible because there is an England to conquer, an administrative system sophisticated enough to be worth capturing intact, a cultural identity strong enough to survive even military defeat. Historians will debate Alfred's ranking among English monarchs. Some will place him below Henry V or Elizabeth I or Victoria. But there is a reasonable argument that Alfred the Great, the only English king ever awarded that title by common consent, is the most important monarch in English history. Because without Alfred, there is no England. The Vikings win. Saxon culture is absorbed into the Danelaw. The island becomes Scandinavian, its history flowing in entirely different channels. The secret weapon that ended the Viking conquest of England was not a new type of sword or a brilliant battlefield tactic. It was something far more powerful and enduring. It was the transformation of a kingdom into a system, of subjects into citizens, of tribal loyalties into national identity. It was the idea that organization and preparation could defeat even superior force, that defense could be systematic rather than desperate, that a people could be taught to defend themselves. Alfred took a defeated kingdom hiding in a marsh and built from it the foundation of a nation. He turned the darkest moment of Saxon history into the beginning of English greatness. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys enemies, but the one that builds something strong enough to outlast them. That is the weapon that changed England forever. That is the legacy of Alfred the Great.